All right, welcome back to the Astrology Reincarnation and Soul webinar on real money and lasting love. This is Kim Marie, and I have been waiting for our special guest, Robert Gover, to show up. I don't know if we will have Robert turn on to this call or not. If so, we'll interrupt things and let him come in. Leroy will be watching the board to see if he does show up. I'm going to go very quickly over these beginning screens. You are all getting very familiar with them. Here is what we offer at Evolutionary Astrology Network. And here is what we offer in our brand new Astro Library that Leroy and I have been actually very excited to create. We finally found a way to put all the information of the different audio and video lectures into
Of
well,
archive.
an archive that is actually useful to people as they study. And then here, of course, is our multimedia course. And Kim Marie will be starting new classes on a webinar basis on segment 2, starting the beginning of next year. And so today's lecture is going to be on time and money, past, present, and future. This is going to be a two-part lecture. Part 1 today is going to be more on the past. Part 2 tomorrow morning will be more on the future. Now, I have went back and forth with Robert on this information over the last year. I have actually followed his work since I think about 2009 or 10, and he's a wealth of information on the history of money and finances and monetary policies from the perspective of an astrologer, but not just what we would know as our typical financial astrologer out there. He really does come from more of a giving, sharing, and including perspective. And if you would read his book, I highly encourage it as a resource for you. That perspective easily comes across in his materials. Now here is his book, Time and Money. If you do go to buy it off Amazon, I would suggest that you make sure you get the second edition, which just came out in the last year, in which he updated it and included information with some of the things that are going to be happening in this upcoming decade as we go through all these interesting aspects of Uranus and Pluto to not only the U.S. chart, but many charts all over the country. I'm just giving you a moment so you can read his little quote here. Now, I'm going to save Robert's personal story, and if he shows up, I'll let him share that. And if not, we'll come back to this at the end of the lecture, and I'll make sure that we go over this. Robert was the type of astrologer who didn't naturally come to reincarnation as many of us evolutionary astrologers do. And again, for the recording, I just want to share that Robert has experienced his Uranus returns, 3 of them, over the course of the last year. He actually natally has Uranus in Aries. For many of us, the whole issue of economics is more of a belief system than anything else. As we know from the practice of evolutionary astrology, that consensus world, 7 out of 10 of us, we have a tendency to just take in wholeheartedly the context of any given lifetime we're born into, the parental, the societal, the religious, and the economic circumstances that we're born into. Then economics can be something that comes from not only society, but your parents. I have some books that I'll share with you at the end of this slide that I also recommend if you want to rewrite your money scripts. But many of us find that economics as a belief comes to us in all different aspects of our life and our society and our religion and our parental values and experiences. And so this whole subject of economics and money can really operate through us on a pretty unconscious level. For instance, Many of us, if you come from the perspective of the United States, have been raised in a societal structure in which there is a belief in corporate profits as being what it's all about here in the United States. The American dream, the quarterly reports for shareholders, the belief that it's about creating as much money for any business, small, medium, large, rather than perhaps having as corporate structure a system in which the wealth and welfare and health of your employees were most. So you can see from what I'm saying here with this manufacturing example in the United States, we get all of these unconscious belief systems built up around the subject of money. And Robert said time and time again in his book, belief trumps the evidence right in front of our eyes. And as he studied the history of this throughout many cultures, he has found that it takes hard aspects from the four outer planets to shake us out of some of these beliefs that are so unconscious around money, beliefs that have no substance in reality and that do not work. And many times it takes a catastrophic event to move us out of these beliefs that we so blindly accept around the issues of money. Now here's just a little glimpse for you, excuse me, in some of the history of money, how we have used money in its different mediums over time. And you can see for as long as we've been able to have some archaeological evidence of history and money, we've had the different ways of utilizing money mediums, from animals to grain to metal coins to tallies to banknotes to Native American Indians using their belts, their wampum belts. We'll talk about a few of these a little bit more here in a little bit. But here is one of the most basic understandings, and all of us in evolutionary astrology can really understand this. Most of our beliefs and our experiences around money can be either matriarchal abundancy or patriarchal scarcity. And again, from our knowledge of evolutionary astrology, we are quite familiar with the fact that up until about 6500 BC, give or take 500 years, we were very matriarchally based societies. Nobody really owned anything. And if we look around us in nature, whether we're looking at the flora or the fauna, we see that nature itself is quite abundant. And so we were steeped in recognizing that type of a belief and that type of a perspective and reality in regards to what we would consider prosperity, or the ability to take care of our necessities, food, clothing, and shelter. And those of us who are in the Western Hemisphere can be quite familiar with that the original people here in North America recognized that the land was Mother Earth and that there wasn't a way to own anything. And so as we had the patriarchal uprising and many of these natural law principles became suppressed, we find ourselves in ancient societies that carried on some of these matriarchal principles for a long time. The example on your screen is where someone would lend a cow and the borrower would repay back the cow and the new calf. As these ancient societies came forward in time and again became more patriarchalized, we started finding other mediums for money. And we started using metal coins. And some of the earliest ways, again, we go back to 6 to 700 BC, the first coins were found in Turkey. And one of the things that happened when we started using commodity money, as it's known, is that there was this problem in that these coins did not reproduce themselves like grain or animals did. Now, one of the other most ancient mediums we used for money was tally sticks. And as a matter of fact, we can go back to 9000 BC, and using the bones of a baboon, we made the first tally stick. You can see on your screen that it's come all the way through history, and you see from the example here, basically what tally sticks were is the lender and the borrower would make notches on the stick, and they would agree to something, and then they'd break it down the middle, and each one would go off and carry their half. And then when they came when the borrower came to pay back the lender, they put the tally stick back together. And because a piece of wood will not break the same way every time, it was kind of a foolproof measure in which there was no fraud. They could just match it back up again, and everybody would then have to agree to what the original agreement was. Now, what's not well known about the United Kingdom, and especially England, is that from the 1100s to the 1500s, that was the main method of money for the average person. Here's another little tidbit for you. Back then, a lot of what you read in history about then, about it being the haves versus the have-nots. Well, guess what? The average person in England back 12, 13, 1400s would only work 1/3 of the year. On average, they could work about 14 weeks out of the year, and they would make enough that they could then pay for all of their needs the rest of the year. And this is supported with facts, but it's not what's popularly mentioned out in the media, especially nowadays. Another little tidbit for you. Back in the 1800s, when they were able to get the public, the average citizens, to stop using tally sticks in England, they had all of the citizens bring the tally sticks from all over the country to London, and they created a bonfire. They burned the tally sticks because they were now going to the goldsmiths and the metal coins, and believe it or not, they burned down I think 3 institutional structures. Let's just say they burned down the bank, they burned down the legislature, they burned down all of the big structures that were where the legislators all operated in England. Interesting tidbits for you. The other thing is coinage. Again, you can see here where we are used to some of the first metal coins that we had. And most of your ancient rulers, as the patriarchy was rising, would establish currencies in their own image. We've shown a few examples here for you. And what happened over time is there emerged 2 different types of money: commodity money and fiat money. And commodity money is money that is valuable in itself. For instance, gold, silver, all of the different metals. But what also started coming up over the centuries is fiat money. And fiat means "so be it" in Latin. And basically, fiat money is whatever we all agree is going to be the medium of money. We, meaning the city-state, meaning countries nowadays in our modern world. And again, if we look through history, coins were not the only money, tally sticks were not the only money. The fiat money could be anything that the collective group would agree upon. Today it is electronic digits. Now, this is coming from Robert's book, Time and Money. And I'll just go through this slowly. This will be the only part so much that I read, but I just found this, I couldn't quite edit this out when Leroy said, edit out, don't read, because this is Robert's perspective of money from his study. Horrible, glorious, gloomy, mysterious stuff. It's no wonder the planet having the most to do with it is Pluto, the most mysterious of the planets, or non-planets looking at it today. Now, from the perspective, or from my personal perspective, I think every single planetary archetype has something to do with money, economics, prosperity. Yes, we can see Venus, ruler of Taurus. We can see Mercury, another earth sign, ruling the details and the keeping track. We can see Saturn having the control of it. We can see Jupiter having the expansion of it. But if you think about how many of us relate to money, and especially as you hear the information over these next two lectures and how naive so many of us are about how money is actually created and operates, I found this quite fascinating to look at Robert's perspective of some of this, and especially Pluto as the ruler of Scorpio and shared resources. Money's mysteriousness is comparable to the great mystery from whence we came into this life, into which we disappear when we die. Pluto's realm. Whether you're a plutocrat or somewhere else in the karmic wheel, Pluto symbolizes this stuff that has become as necessary to survival today as air and water. Many people believe money is evil. Actually, it's the love of money that is so famously evil. Money itself is neutral. It can be used for good or evil. Just so, Pluto is alternately experienced as good or evil, depending on how it's aspected by other heavenly bodies. Yet in this realm, Hades, it's a fearsome place, often equated with Christian hell. You might say that Hades is merely myth or legend, not to be taken literally. Yet one version or another of this myth seems to get passed down to us in our genes. Now, as we came through history and we started working with the metals in patriarchal societies, it was too hard for people to carry around their gold and silver. First of all, it weighed too much, and you could easily get robbed. So there became this habit over Northern Europe for people to put their money with the goldsmiths, and they would have their vaults and their guards. And the goldsmiths got in the habit of lending out paper receipts for the amount of gold or silver, the commodity money, that they kept in their vaults. So people give the goldsmith their coins, and the goldsmith would give them paper receipts, fiat money. And the people got into the habit of trading these paper receipts and worked just as well. And what the goldsmiths recognized is that nobody ever came back and got 100% of their coins out. Over time, they noticed people would take out approximately 10% at a time. And this is what led to what we call fractional reserve banking. Now, this is how it exists today. Banks lend more money than they keep in their vaults as deposits or reserves, whether it's coins or whether it is the paper fiat money today. Now, what would happen throughout the course of history, and many of us might know this from the 1930s, is that the public would get afraid over something that would happen, and there'd become panics, and there'd be runs on the banks. And the banks would literally collapse because they did not have enough in reserves to cover the customer deposits. More on this as we see how the banks came to come up with rules for how they would deal with this. Well, here's what you need to notice, is that if if a bank is only required to have 10% of reserves, that means $100. Let's say you deposit $100 in your bank can lend that $100 out 10 times, 100% or $1,000. And as a matter of fact, most of the banks today around the world only keep reserves in their vaults, whether it is coins, whether it is paper fiat money, or whether it's electronic digits. They only keep reserve ratios today of 3 to 5%. Now, the BIS, which is the Bank for International Settlements, it is slowly but surely increasing these reserves. It's trying to increase them up to 5%, 6%, 8% on our small little community banks and credit unions. And what it's doing is it's squeezing the banks and their abilities to lend money. History is full of examples where public and private interests compete over the control of money and monetary policies. Now, public is always represented as citizens, taxpayers, and usually the government, representing citizens and taxpayers. The private interests are the bankers and the financial elites. We'll get to a lot of astrology charts here in the last part of this slideshow, okay? Leroy, while you're on mute, why don't you bring me up my little cell phone so that I can keep track of what I'm talking, because I can give a lot more anecdotes than I probably have time to share.
Sure.
Rothschild, you've heard of that name. This is one of the most famous quotes in history. Give me the control of a nation's money, and I care not who make the laws. The Rothschilds came out of the area that we would know as Dutch, the Netherlands. And Mayer actually had 5 boys. And he sent a Rothschild to England, a Rothschild to France, a Rothschild to Germany, Spain, and maybe he kept one at home. But the way that the European financial elites really came to have so much control over a lot of the European financial systems is because Mayer had 5 boys and he sent them over, and they were pretty much successful in private bankers taking over government monetary policies. The Bank of England is probably the European control of money passed over to the Bank of England. Again, Robert would know little itty bitty details of this, and you can read some of those things in his books. But over time, a lot of the European financial interest ended up coming into England's power. And you will know that in the 1600s, after Queen Elizabeth I passed in, I think it was 1603, throughout the 1600s, there was a lot of back and forth energy between the Tudors and other European cousins who were trying to get power over the English throne. And King William was allowed to power in the late 1600s because he literally gave control of England's monetary supply over to the private European bankers, basically these Rothschilds. And so it was really back in 1694 the Bank of England was created, and that we had the first permanent federal loan to a government, in which the only thing the government would pay back was interest. And what's important was that the control of the money was given to the private bankers. They were allowed to create the money, print the money, and loan it to the government to be repaid with interest, i.e. by the taxpayers with interest. It was also at this time period that the Bank of England then formalized fractional reserve lending. Again, that lending out more than what you actually had in reserves or deposits. As a lot of your Europeans came over to the U.S. colonies, We're all familiar with hearing about the Tea Party revolt. And you can see from your picture, looks like a Native American throwing tea over into the waters. It was actually the European males dressed as Indians. I thought that was kind of interesting when I went searching for pictures of this. But it was in the U.S. colonies that we really had some of the first examples of public banking. And in other words, the government really creating its own monetary supplies, creating, printing, controlling its own money, and they would do it with colonial scrips, which was paper money. When many of the Europeans came over to the colonies, there was a scarcity of gold and silver. And so Benjamin Franklin and the Quakers, all the colonies ended up doing it, but the most successful example was in Pennsylvania, where the Quakers created their own colonial scrip, and they traded it all over throughout their colony very successfully. The other colonies started adopting it, and as a matter of fact, none of these colonies really had any local taxes on their citizens when their governments created their own monies. One of the things to recognize is when the supply of money is equal to the demand for goods and services, inflation stays in check. I have a slide on this, so I'm going to repeat this. When the supply of money is equal to the demand for goods and services, inflation stays in check. Inflation meaning increasing the amount of what it takes to buy goods and services. So what happened, these colonies were flourishing so well that King George then passed law, again colonies were still subjects of England, passed law that all the taxes owed to England, which were many, had to be paid in gold. And when that law was passed, the colonies collapsed, and that is what led to the Declaration of Independence. That's what led to the war. That's what the Tea Party revolt was all about. That was the first battle. Again, where the private bankers of England operating behind King George battled it out with public banking, the citizens, and the citizens lost. So the history of the United States, and I thank our international listeners for allowing me to share this history of the U.S. banking battles. When we get into part 2 tomorrow, you will see that we'll get into a lot more of your international examples, and I'll show you how this private versus public banking showdown, which is going to be coming over this decade, we'll see how it is rising to be a battle on an international level. But the entire U.S. history is full of private versus public battles over who is going to get the control of the monetary supply. And what has happened in the course of the United States history is there was the first national bank, the second national bank. These were the European financial elites trying to come in and create these banks that would get control of printing the money and loaning it to the government at interest. Andrew Jackson, even if you know his history, he was not really the nicest person, but he was pretty smart when it came to recognizing what the private banking systems were trying to do. And he denied the charter renewal of the Second National Bank. And there was literally an assassination attempt on him after this happened. It didn't work, basically because the powder in the assassinator's gun was wet and the gun didn't go off. Fast forward to Abraham Lincoln. He was assassinated. Those of you who really search into the histories will recognize that when the Civil War came about, and there's even information and theory that the European interests were behind trying to create the civil war and this back and forthness over slavery and whether or not we should have it. Part of the reason why they were behind this interest was because trying to supply the money for these two sides to actually be able to pay for the war. And so Abraham Lincoln was allowed to create greenbacks. In other words, he was allowed to have the federal government create these greenbacks to pay for the Civil War on the condition that he would stop using greenbacks after the war was over if he won. Well, he won. He used the greenbacks to pay for the war. And then his Treasury Secretary said, oh, by the way, why should we pay the banks interest? Why not just create our own money? They passed, I don't know whether it wasn't a law, I don't know what you call it on the executive branch. They passed an order, let's say, to do that. And lo and behold, within a month, Lincoln was gone. Now, I did not put this slide in here, but I'll also share this little detail too. Back in the 1960s, President Kennedy, JFK, was preparing to do the same thing. And there are those who feel that he was assassinated for the same reason, because he was going to take back the federal power of the government to create its own money. So the bankers in the U.S. finally succeeded with the Federal Reserve conspiracy in the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. This is where Robert is a real expert, and if I get him on tomorrow, we'll do that one. We'll be able to have him tomorrow. I'll let him share some details on this. Take a moment and read this quote by Lincoln. The money powers prey upon the nation in times of peace and conspire against it in times of adversity. It denounces as public enemies all who question its methods or throw light upon its crimes. I have two great enemies, the Southern Army in front of me and the bankers in the rear. Of the two, the one at my rear was my greatest foe. Turned out to be quite prophetic. Now, in Robert's book, he talks about the Federal Reserve, or the Federal Conspiracy of 1910. And basically, by then, and it happened down in Jekyll Island, Georgia. And if you Google search Jekyll Island, you'll find some great books upon what actually happened during that time period. By then, a lot of the European financial elites had migrated to the United States. They had intermarried with a lot of your American names. They had started capitalistic ventures with them. Think Carnegie, Morgan, Rockefeller, Nelson. They were all in cahoots here, and they basically traveled down to this island in Georgia in November of 2010 for a duck hunt. They didn't travel by their known names. It was very secretive. And in Robert's research, this is the chart that he came up with for this meeting on Jekyll Island. And he said, basically, look at the Grand Trine here on this chart. And look at it in air signs, earth houses. The conspiracy, the not telling the public the truth, not letting the public know what was going on, as these bankers wanted to conspire to really set up control of the American monetary system, to allow, again, private bankers to print the money, loan it back to the government with interest that needed to be paid off the backs of its citizens. You can see all of the Scorpio planets. You see that Sun conjunct the South Node. Those of us in the EA know. You see Mercury there. You see Venus there. This is not the first time, again, that the European financial interests tried to wrestle control of the money away from United States citizens. Now, I don't have Robert here to tell this story. He told it to me over our studies. He uses the Gemini rising chart, which is the 2:17 a.m. chart with the 8 degrees Gemini rising. happens to be the same chart that Jeffrey Wolf Green used. Now in Robert's research, he thinks that both charts work. So the other chart is 5:10 p.m. on July 4th. I think it's 5:10 p.m. That's known as the Sibley chart. And these are probably two of the most widely used charts for the United States. And in Robert's study of U.S. history, economic history, most of the founders of the Declaration of Independence were Freemasons. And I refer you back to, I'm blanking out here on Scott Wolfram's talk, when he talked about the Freemasons chart and the United States Sibley chart, and how they looked at, you can see my mouse here, this Sun-Saturn square. Freemasons looked at this not so much as a detriment, but as the opportunity to create enough tension to really do something with finances. What Robert feels is that many of these Freemasons, at the end of the day, discussing politics in City Hall or wherever, Philadelphia in this case, they would end up in the pub for the meal and a little bit of beer. And so he feels that this 2:17 a.m. chart, and he's not the one who came up with it. I don't remember who came up with it. Robert might know that. But he feels that this might have been the time in the wee hours of the morning where they all kind of finally had the light bulb and said, this is it. This is what we'll do. And then the next day, July 4th, later in the afternoon, they finally all came to the agreement back in City Halls again. So both charts work. But he felt that because they were Freemasons, they would have been aware of astrology, and they would have definitely put Venus, Jupiter, and the Sun, three of the planets most well known for dealing with finances. Remember, we didn't know Pluto existed at that time, let alone Uranus or Neptune. They would have put these three planets in the second house, the Taurus house of money. So there's his reckoning behind that. But looking at this from the Federal Conspiracy of 1910, you can see how Neptune trying to pull the wool over the public in regards to what they were saying they were going to do. This was back in the populist movement in early 1910, when there had been enough panics and runs on the banks that people didn't trust the federal government to have control. So the banking elite would use that fear and say one thing and do another. Now, again, I'm going to continue on because I want to move through these charts well enough. Charles Lindbergh was in Congress in 1913 when the Federal Reserve was created. The financial system has been turned over to the Federal Reserve Board. That board administers the finance system by authority of a purely profiting group. The system is private, conducted for the sole purpose of obtaining the greatest possible profits from the use of other people's money. In 1913, the U.S. Federal Reserve Act was passed. The Federal Reserve is a private institution. Its 12 branches are 100% owned by private banks. With the passing of this act, the financial elites succeeded in acquiring a monopoly over the creation of money or credit in the United States. The Federal Reserve loans money to the government at interest. With the passing of this act, the legislative and executive branches of the federal government gave away the constitutional power to coin money and regulate the value thereof. Here's the chart for when President Woodrow Wilson, who later came to regret signing this. Here's the chart. December 23rd, 1913, 6:02 p.m. in Washington. This is when he signed the act. just before Christmas when all the legislators were hurrying home. And they passed it through with writing, you'll appreciate this today, with writing so obscure that nobody could understand what it actually meant. There were many legislators who came to regret voting for this bill afterwards. Again, Charles Lindbergh being one of them. Voted for it, then when he realized what he voted for, said regretted it. Interesting, when Pluto went into Capricorn in 2008 and we had the financial meltdown, there was little stirrings in the news about the Federal Reserve and how it was a private organization. It didn't get very far in the public media. But there were little, I remember little articles written for it. And you see right here, look at this chart, 12th house Pluto. We want to hide control from the people. Look at the power grab right here with the Sun-Pluto opposition that is going on. Now, stay tuned. In tomorrow's talk, I'm going to talk about these planets here in Cancer, Capricorn. We'll talk about transiting Saturn as it goes over this Scorpio moon in a little bit. We're going to see here in the future with Neptune, Chiron coming over this part. But another thing that I would point out for you from the perspective of evolutionary astrology, Saturn square the nodes, and you can even say with wide orbs, Mercury, Venus square the orbs. So here are the skip steps with honesty to the public, with who's going to have the control over. I mean, again, this whole chart is about control of the monetary supply in the United States, public versus private, and private won. So you can see, again, with Venus square the nodes, Mercury square the nodes, there was not this honesty. It represents this history of fighting over this control, over the money, literally, over the power, over the control of the monetary policies and how we're going to do this. And this is where the United States legislators gave it away. Now, this is where I am not as knowledgeable as Robert, but in his research, what he has found is whenever the United States runs through depressions, we will always find Saturn in Capricorn opposing the United States Sun. Now, because Saturn has a 28, 29-year cycle, we find that this happens about once every 30 years. We do not find a depression or repression every time this comes along. Other factors tend to be along with it. And what we do find is, again, usually it is the outer planets that are involved along with Saturn in Capricorn. It's not only making the opposition to the U.S. Sun, it's also making squares. When Saturn hangs out here in Capricorn, it also makes squares to itself natally. So I'm just briefly going to show you these charts. Oh, first of all, take a moment. Here's the difference between recession, depression, Great Depression. Recessions 1 to 3 years, unemployment generally below 12%. Now these standards are starting to be taken on a international level. When we have a recession lasting more than 3 years and or the rate of unemployment lies between 12 and 20%, it becomes classified as a depression. When unemployment remains high and businesses stagnate for more than 6 years, then a nation may come into what's called the Great Depression. It's quite possible, as we look back in history throughout this decade, that it may come to be known as a Great Depression, not just in the United States and Europe, but in many of the countries where we have private central banking systems. So here is the one of the first ones. I'm going to go through 4 of them quite quickly. Rather than give a bunch of information in regards to this, I'm just going to allow you to look at these charts. You're going to have the recordings to refer back to these, but you can see back in the 1780s. With Robert tomorrow, we can recap here what was going on during those time periods. This one obviously was right after the war. And we got our independence from England, but we didn't quite know how we were going to actually create our central banking system. But you can see Saturn here, opposing U.S. Sun, squaring its own Saturn. It was a time period where there was a lot of uncertainty and chaos around monetary supply and policy in the United States. We also had one in the 1840s. The Industrial Revolution was rising. We were heading into, it was in 1838 that President Jackson canceled the second renewal of the charter of the Second National Bank. And it threw all the banking into chaos. The private banking systems had lost, but what was going to replace it? And you can see there were multiple aspects going on. I don't point them all out to get kind of chaotic on the screens. I tried to take just a few of the big ones from some of Robert's notes. But again, Saturn in Capricorn. Then we went back just 30, or we go forward just 30 years to the next Saturn in Capricorn cycle. It was after the Civil War. There was again, it was, they had fought back Lincoln with the greenbacks, and there was a lot of chaos going on again over who would have the control of the monetary policies. And then here's this one, Great Depression of the 1930s. Anybody surprised that Saturn was in Capricorn, opposing the U.S. Cancer Sun? Not only that, many of us know that that was the waning square of Uranus and Aries too. Pluto in Cancer, and Jupiter was hanging out there as well. Now, what's not always well known is we passed the Federal Reserve Act in 1930. We had the Federal Reserve with the 12 branches across the United States. Well, up until 1935, the 12 branches of the Federal Reserve each printed their own monetary supply of money. And these 12 branches kind of got carried away, especially the Federal Reserve branch of New York. They started printing money, they started gambling in the stock market, and the Federal Reserve Board and whoever was president at that time, I forget his name, they put a kibosh to it, and they collapsed the money supply and told the 12 branches that they had to have so much in reserves of gold. And it literally created the stock market crash and the Great Depression of the 1930s. The Federal Reserve of the United States, the private banking system, was totally responsible for the Depression. Well-known fact if you care to check out the facts. Here's the other thing to recognize. U.S. stock market crashes always tends to happen when the U.S. Mars-Neptune square is hit by hard angles, conjunctions, opposition squares, and usually from the outer planets. Robert has multiple examples in his book, Time and Money. Now, we don't have a bunch of examples in here, and every time Robert's said to me, he says, just because we get aspects of hard angles from the outer planets, Saturn through Pluto, to the U.S. Sun Saturn doesn't always mean a depression or recession. Just because we get them to Mars Neptune squares doesn't always mean we have a stock market crash. But every time we have a depression, Saturn's in Capricorn, every time we have stock market crashes, the United States Neptune Mars square is involved. For instance, the crash of 2008. As you can see, Pluto was in late Sag. It had been over that Mars, opposing Mars for several years, and we had Saturn approaching Neptune. We had Uranus and Pisces opposing Neptune. Again, I found it quite interesting that Robert Gover uses wide orbs, just like evolutionary astrology does. Get everything in a process. Now, I've not even been taking much of a breath because I wanted to get through all of Robert's information. I'm coming along pretty good. I have a few more slides I'm going to do, and then I'll be happy to go back to it. Oh, by the way, stay tuned to this. I have some charts for part 2 tomorrow in this coming decade that will have a lot to do with this Mars-Neptune square. Anybody guess which planets those will be? So, a lot of my information, as I worked with Robert, and Robert and I are both big fans of Ellen Brown. This is Robert's book again, Time and Money, the Economy and the Planets. Make sure you get the second edition if you'd like to pursue some of this stuff in more detail. It's a great book. He writes as a novelist. That's his background. He's written a lot of novels, and he writes about money from a fictional point of view because then it's not so threatening to powers that be. Ellen Brown, on the other hand, writes from a purely non-fictional point of view, giving us the facts. And her website, webofdebt.com, I cannot recommend it highly enough. Her new book, The Public Bank Solution, just came out about 3 months ago. And this is not only a book for the United States. This is a global financial book. If you care about personal prosperity, if you care about prosperity for others, get this book. She talks about public versus private banking in all countries of the world. And as a matter of fact, one of the things that Ellen Brown has done for the United States is create the Public Banking Institute. And you can go there and find out all kinds of information. It's geared for the United States. But international listeners, you'll still find a lot of valuable information in this because they share articles from New Zealand and Australia to India to China to Europe to Spain to Greece to England to Greenland to Iceland. I mean, every country is in the news right now with Pluto and Capricorn and Uranus and Aries in regards to this issue of private versus public control of monetary supply. Oh, I did make it through my slides. All right, I did so good. Now we'd have a bit more detail if we had Robert in the picture. So I'm looking at my time, and I'm going to keep us on time, all right? And so what I would like to do now is allow for a little bit of Q&A if anybody has any questions for me on anything that has been coming up. All right, so I just glanced at the questions. Looks like they're going pretty good. Roy, do we have anybody who has any questions? You're welcome to unmute if anybody wants to ask me about anything that I've covered. I can easily go back on the slides too.
Not yet. You've covered, did a real good job in the on deck circle there, Kim. Thank you very much. For those of you out there as attendees, I'm sure you can understand there's a lot to presenting an entire conference in a week-long format like this with all the technical issues and the content. And you know, to be able to jump in like you did on Robert's behalf and present this information just is a real nice thing to see. And of course, we wouldn't expect anything less. So thank you, Kim.
Robert and I our collaboration was, Robert, you send me details and I'll make a slideshow. And so we went back and forth over the last month together, and this detail and that detail, and several conversations over the phone. So I have been fascinated with this information. And so again, I'll kind of go backwards over some of these charts and a little bit, and I'll go back to this Federal Reserve chart for you as well. But any of you want to just again get any dates, and when Robert would pick out some of these dates for charts, it wasn't so much the specific day. I think maybe it was right around October 6th when the stock market was really starting its downward swing. Um, Ironically enough, it was either my first or second time to go head to New York and my deep memory processing, and it was back in the 2008 presidential elections with Barack Obama, and and we had the Saturn-Uranus oppositions, and I remember all of us just being glued to TV sets when we weren't in session watching what was going on with the news, but I don't remember paying so much attention to the United States chart. And as you can see, when we had that crash, look at Jupiter and the moon here, you know, opposing itself, opposing the U.S. sun, squaring the Saturn, and all of these things going on. It's come back for tomorrow's lecture because you will be fascinated by some of the charts we put up for the rest of this decade and even into the early 2020s with the Fed, the U.S. chart, and some of the other countries with various things that are going on here. So that was the crash.
You know,
And
Kim, one
we'll,
comment I have about the crash, you know, with that Mars Neptune implicated, of course, everybody on this call, uh, you know, Mars Neptune can certainly indicate a lot about, you know, intentions below the surface, honesty or dishonesty. And isn't it interesting that every one of the crashes, you know, that Robert in his research revealed was really, you know, that was the trigger point. So it does kind of reveal the underlying intent in 1910 through 1913 to push through this Federal Reserve Act, does it not?
yes, that can be part of it, but I'm looking at it from the perspective of the United States chart. And, you know, many of these crashes have always been about that battle of public versus private control of the monetary supply and policy. And so I look at these crashes as many times these private systems being unsustainable. And the crash was necessary to give us that chance or that opportunity to correct it.
To wake up, yeah.
Remember, yes, to wake up. Remember, our founding fathers in the United States, those Freemasons, they didn't know Neptune existed. They didn't know Neptune was making the square to Mars at that time.
That's a good
They
point.
didn't
Yeah.
they didn't know yeah, they didn't know that Pluto was opposing the Mercury. Now, historically, everybody, Jeffrey Green always felt that the United States was the ninth house Pluto, you know, because of so much of the religious freedom. It wasn't that the financial or monetary battles were the only thing going on. Yes, there was the religious freedom issue as much as the financial issue.
Yeah,
And
or throwing off all that religious conditioning with the Pluto retrograde.
yes, yes. And you know, I had not, you know, as I've been reading over this last year as well, I didn't realize how much the Puritans were clamping down on things in England and Europe. And so there were the Puritans who came over here to practice religious freedom. But so many of those Puritans, for any of you who have any past life memory, and I've got some, I've done some work on those past lives, you know, they came over here. Their religious freedom was because they wanted to actually clamp down on morality. They were feeling that, you know, London was
Mm.
heathen,
Hmm.
and a lot of Europe was too heathen. And so their religious freedom was to come over here to the United States and be as oppressed as they wanted to be. And that was, an interesting concept to also be able to look at in regards to understanding a deeper issue in that regard.
That's an interesting dynamic. I never really
hmm
pondered much.
I saw my question pane come up. So,
Roland says, "What's your opinion about the founding fathers? Are they in on the private takeover, or were they in on it, or not? I mean, that's a
not
hypothetical."
at all, not at all, Roland. They were not in on it at all. And as a matter of fact, remember when I talked about Benjamin Franklin and the Quakers in Pennsylvania, and they created their own colonial scripts and had no local taxes? They were so successful and so prosperous that the colonies sent, um, who was it? Thomas Jefferson. I get him and Ben mixed up sometimes. They sent Jefferson over to England to talk to their legislatures and tell them how successful they were with Ben Franklin. It was Ben. They sent Benjamin Franklin over to England, and he actually told them how successful all these colonies were with creating their own colonial scripts. And his visit over there to England is what made King George issue his ultimatum that all of the colony taxes had to be paid in gold. So the founding fathers were all for public control of the money. And King George, of course, ever since 1694, and by then we were into the middle 1700s, all of the English kings were by then controlled by the European financial elites. England gave away control of its money in 1694. Now, you would hear different things about the Bank of England, which was established in 1694, about it going back and forth between being public and private. But the bottom line is we've had 300 years of the Bank of England being in cahoots with the financial elites, the private banking system.
And Roland also makes the observation that out of all the founding fathers, Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams were perhaps the most awake of that
Yes.
group.
Yes, they were the Freemasons. And so again, it's Robert's Gover's understanding that let me get to this chart, that this 2:17 a.m. chart was probably the one that the founding fathers were in upon.
Thanks for that
I mean,
comment, Daniel. That was Daniel, not Roland.
oh,
Thank you.
okay, yeah. I mean, think about it back in the days when these people were coming over from England, and if you lived in Europe, 14, 15, 1600s, you didn't drink the water. You drank beer and wine because you did it for health reasons. And and he said it was just his feeling and from his research and readings that, many of these people, they went to the pub because that's where you got your meal, especially if you were a bachelor. That's where you got your meal, and that's where you got your little pint. And so, there was probably many, many conversations that took place late into the evenings in the local pubs as their colonial scripts were outlawed and their, you know, budding success of prosperity was being squashed. And one of the things to also realize about many of these financial elites, and if you go to read any of Ellen Brown's Web of Debt, there's this whole shadow banking system that is literally taking place all across the world. And go search her articles page. She's now put it onto a blog so that you can comment back and forth. She wrote an article on her blog about, within this last month, it's been within the last few weeks, And this is also in her new book, The Public Banking Solution, and she is exposing how countries like many of those countries in the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Iran, it's not just the oil that we're having a battle over. On the shadow banking side of the system, these countries are um, they're audacious enough to be switching over to um, public central banking, public control, governmental control of their monetary supplies. And they are starting to trade with other countries outside the dollar. Now, mind you, it was in the 1970s that um, World Trade Organization, I think it was requiring all these countries that they had to trade back and forth, whether it's goods and services or oil and resources. They had the medium in which things had to be traded was the dollar. Stay tuned for more on that tomorrow as the emerging showdown is coming this decade, and we'll show you some more on that. But go to Ellen Brown's site, webofdebt.com,
That was there
and
was a little misspelling in that URL. It is indeed Web of Debt, DEBT.
like I have.
Just missed a letter. It's okay. I'm sure everybody got it, honey.
Oh.
But
Oh, one of
um,
them.
yeah, it's fine.
I'll
It's fine.
correct that one. Yeah, I'll correct that one. Thank you for that, Leroy.
So thank
You,
you, Kim, and I just kind of want to again keep us on time and let you off the hook here. It's a great fill-in job for Robert. We know we can get him back up on the air tomorrow morning for not only to fill in some of the quotes and some of his input on this lecture, but part two of Time and Money,
yeah.
Past, Present, and Future.
Any final questions from anybody?
The pertinent one to Judy, I'm not sure. Are all these are the Eastern Bloc, the Eastern countries, still supporting public banking after the U.S. takeovers? That's a interesting question. Eastern countries relating to
Well, tomorrow, as we talk about time and money into the future, we'll talk about what's called the BRICS, BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South America.
And yes,
Stay tuned.
it would be interesting. Another comment came in, Kim, about taking a look at Lucifer, the asteroid Lucifer, in relation to some of this deception, elite bankers and the influence that Lucifer might
Mm.
have had on these charts. That might be
Oh.
a good study for another webinar, but probably out of the scope of these closing
You know
questions.
what? If I remember correctly, I think the United States Lucifer hangs out by its moon, by the moon. I think Lucifer's in Aquarius in the United States chart. I'll do that detail for you. I'll find where Lucifer is in the Federal Reserve, and I'll find out where it is in the United States chart for you as well. I don't know how
Okay.
to put the glyph in, but I can definitely give you that information tomorrow.